The bay gelding named Sovereign threw his head so hard the brass bit rang like a church bell, and Specialist Thorne, who had been holding the bridle chain, stumbled 2 steps sideways into the wet grass. That was the first sign that something at Arlington National Cemetery was about to go sideways on a Tuesday morning in October. The caisson platoon of the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment, better known to the world as the Old Guard, was staged along the service road behind Section 60, preparing for a full honor's funeral. 6 coal-black horses stood hitched to the caisson, a 1918-era artillery limber that had carried more flag-draped caskets to their final rest than any vehicle in American history. The horses were immaculate, their coats brushed to a liquid shine, their ceremonial tack polished to a mirror finish. Everything was precise, rehearsed, and timed to the second. Captain Miles Ashford, the platoon commander, stood at the head of the formation with his white gloves tucked under his arm and his jaw set at an angle that suggested the world existed primarily to meet his expectations. He was 27 years old, West Point class of 2021, and had been commanding the caisson platoon for exactly 4 months. In that time, he had instituted 7 new standard operating procedures, drafted 2 memoranda on stable discipline, and earned the quiet, careful neutrality of every non-commissioned officer under him, which is the military's polite way of saying they tolerated him. He was not a bad officer. He was simply a young one who had mistaken proximity to tradition for ownership of it. The funeral was scheduled for 1100 hours. The deceased was a retired colonel, Korea and Vietnam, 2 Silver Stars, a man who had outlived most of his contemporaries and was now being borne to his rest by horses and soldiers who had never known him. It was, in its way, the most profound gesture the nation could offer, this ritual performed by strangers with the reverence of family. Ashford understood the choreography of it. He did not yet understand the weight. At 10:32, the problem began. An old man appeared at the edge of the tree line bordering the service road. He had come from the direction of the visitor parking lot, following the winding path through the headstones with the slow, unhurried gait of someone who knew the geography of grief. He wore a canvas ranch coat the color of dry sage, pearl snap western shirt beneath it, jeans that had been washed 1,000 times, and a pair of scuffed Tony Lama boots that had seen more miles than most cars. His face was deeply lined, the skin tanned to the color of old leather, and his hair, what remained of it, was white and cropped close to his skull in a style that hadn't been fashionable since the Kennedy administration. He carried a single stem of white carnation in his left hand. He was not supposed to be here. The service road was closed to civilian foot traffic during funeral preparations, blocked by a discreet chain and a sign that read "Authorized personnel only." But the chain had been unhooked by a grounds crew truck 20 minutes earlier, and the old man had simply walked through the gap as if it were his own front gate. He stopped about 40 yards from the formation, just inside the shadow of a red oak, and watched. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, holding his carnation, and looked at the horses. That was when Sovereign lost his composure. The big gelding had been standing forth in the hitch, a position reserved for the steadiest animal in the string, and for 7 months he had earned that spot with a temperament like poured concrete. Nothing moved him. Not the rifle volleys, not the roar of motorcades, not the screaming of jets overhead during flyovers. Sovereign was, by every measure, the most reliable horse in the platoon's stable of 43 animals. But now he was tossing his head, pulling against the traces, his nostrils flared wide, dragging in great lungfuls of morning air, and his eyes, his dark, intelligent eyes, were fixed on the old man under the tree. Thorne, the handler, got his footing back and pulled down on the chain. "Easy, Sov. Easy, big man." The horse ignored him completely. His ears swiveled forward, locked on the old man like radar dishes, and a sound began to roll from his chest, a low, vibrating nicker that Thorne had never heard before. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to recognition, or the desperate attempt at it, like hearing a song you know but can't quite name. Within seconds, the contagion spread. The horse in the 3rd position, a German-bred Percheron cross named Gallant, stamped his right foreleg 3 times in rapid succession, his iron shoe striking sparks off the asphalt. The lead pair, 2 matched black geldings named Kestrel and Bishop, began to shift and fidget, their massive bodies swaying against the traces, throwing the alignment of the entire hitch off by 6 inches and then 8 and then a foot. The caisson groaned on its springs. The flags snapped in the breeze, and the riderless horse, the cap horse, the animal with the empty boots, reversed in the stirrups that would walk alongside the caisson as a symbol of a fallen warrior, a 9-year-old thoroughbred mare named Dakota, began to pull against her handler so hard that the young specialist holding her lead rope was dragged 3 feet across the pavement, his boots scraping lines in the gravel. "What the hell is happening?" Ashford snapped, turning from his position at the head of the column. His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. He saw 6 horses in various states of unrest, 4 handlers struggling to maintain control, and a funeral party of 63 family members and dignitaries due to arrive in 22 minutes. This was not a drill. This was not a training exercise. This was a real funeral for a real hero, and his horses were acting like they'd never seen a Tuesday. Then he saw the old man. Ashford's face hardened. The equation was simple. His horses had been calm, a civilian had appeared. His horses were no longer calm. Therefore, the civilian was the problem. He strode down the line, his boot heels clicking a metronome of irritation against the road surface, and crossed the grass to the tree line in 6 long steps. "Sir, this area is closed to the public." His voice was polite in the way that a locked door is polite. "I need you to return to the main visitor path immediately." The old man looked at him. His eyes were the color of rain, pale gray and deeply quiet, and they held no surprise, no apology, no particular concern. "I know the area's closed, son. I just came to visit a friend. Section 12. Thought I'd walk the long way around. Section 12 is accessible from the main entrance." Ashford gestured with a crisp, directional hand. "If you'll head back the way you came, the information center can direct you." The old man didn't move. His gaze had drifted past Ashford's shoulder to the horses, and something in his expression shifted. A softening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips, the look of a man seeing ghosts. He watched Sovereign strain against the traces, watched Gallant stamp and blow, watched Dakota pull her handler like a kite in a gale. "Your cap horse is going to snap that lead if your boy doesn't give her some slack," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She's not fighting him. She's trying to get to the front of the column. That's not panic. That's rank confusion. She thinks the formation's wrong." Ashford blinked. The observation was so precise, so casually delivered, that for a half-second he didn't know how to respond. Then his training kicked in and slammed the door shut. "Sir, I appreciate the concern, but these are military ceremonial horses. They're handled by trained specialists. I need you to clear the area. Your presence is disturbing the animals." "I'm not disturbing them." The old man's voice was calm, without defiance, just stating a fact. "They're disturbed because they can feel something they haven't felt before. Or maybe something they haven't felt in a long time. There's a difference." Ashford's patience, which had never been his most abundant resource, evaporated. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a tight, controlled hiss. "Sir, I am conducting a funeral detail. I have a Gold Star family arriving in 19 minutes. If these horses are not settled and in formation by the time that motorcade comes through those gates, it will be a disgrace to the uniform and to the man we are burying. So I am asking you, respectfully, one last time to leave." But the old man, whose name was Gage Lindquist, was no longer looking at Ashford. He was watching a horse. Specifically, he was watching Sovereign, and Sovereign was watching him, and between them stretched a line of tension so visible, so electric, that it seemed to shimmer in the autumn air like heat-off asphalt in summer. 30 feet away, leaning against the fender of the platoon's supply truck, with her arms folded across her chest, Master Sergeant Corinne Liddell observed the entire exchange with the patient, cataloging attention of a woman who had spent 21 years around military horses. She was the platoon's senior NCO, the institutional memory that kept the unit functioning while officers rotated through on their 18-month command tours. She had seen 9 platoon commanders come and go, each with their own ideas and ambitions, and she had learned long ago that the horses were the constant. Officers were weather. The horses were the mountain. Liddell had noticed the old man before Ashford had. She'd seen him come through the gap in the chain with a deliberateness that wasn't trespassing so much as returning, and she'd been watching the horse's reaction with a growing sense of something she couldn't name, a prickling at the base of her skull, the feeling you get when a piece of a puzzle you've been working on for years suddenly turns up under the couch cushion. She studied the old man with professional eyes. Ashford saw a ranch hand. Liddell saw something else. She saw the way he held his weight, balanced evenly on both feet, his center of gravity low and settled, the stance of a man who had spent decades around animals that outweighed him by 1,000 pounds and could kill him with a single kick. She saw his hands, thick and scarred, the knuckles of his right hand carrying a ridge of white scar tissue that she recognized instantly. Rope burn, the kind you get when a lunge line rips through your grip because a 1,200-pound horse on the other end has decided to go somewhere else. His left thumb was slightly crooked, healed from an old break, bent at an angle that spoke of being caught between a halter ring and a fence post. But it was his stillness that held her attention. He stood the way the old horsemasters stood, the ones from Fort Riley, from the cavalry school, from a tradition that predated trucks and helicopters and all the mechanisms of modern warfare. He stood as if the ground beneath him was the only ground that existed, and everything else, the noise, the chaos, the anxious young captain, was just weather passing over the mountain. Liddell felt her breath catch. She had spent 3 years at the Army's Veterinary Corps Liaison Office, and she'd had access to historical records that most soldiers never saw. Training manuals from the 1950s and 1960s, before the Army officially disbanded the last horse cavalry units and converted entirely to mechanized forces. In those manuals, there were references to a program, never fully documented, never officially acknowledged, that had attempted to create a deeper bond between rider and mount, a method of communication that went beyond reins and spurs and voice commands into something almost telepathic. The program had no official name. In the margins of one water-damage manual from 1963, someone had written 2 words in pencil, Stillwater Protocol. Liddell had assumed it was folklore. Every branch of the military had its legends, its ghost stories, its whispered tales of capabilities that existed beyond the official record. She had filed it away as an interesting footnote and moved on. But now, watching this old rancher stand motionless under an oak tree, while 6 of the most disciplined ceremonial horses in the world came apart at the seams trying to get closer to him, she wasn't so sure it was folklore anymore. The situation was deteriorating by the second. Sovereign lunged forward, and the entire left side of the hitch lurched with him, the caisson rolling 6 inches before the wheel brake caught. The sound of metal grinding on metal was a shriek that cut through the morning air and startled a flock of starlings from the oak canopy. Gallant reared, not fully, but enough to lift his front hooves 6 inches off the ground, and his handler, a young specialist named Yamada, was thrown backward onto the grass. Dakota's handler had wrapped the lead rope around his forearm, a desperate and dangerous mistake, and the mare was now circling him in a tight, agitated orbit, the rope tightening with each revolution. "Unwrap that rope!" Ashford barked at the handler. "You want to lose that arm?" He turned to Thorne. "Get Sovereign under control. Use the stud chain if you have to." The commands were correct. The technique was textbook. And it was accomplishing absolutely nothing because the horses weren't listening to their handlers. They were listening to something else, something deeper than commands, something coded into the very architecture of their nervous systems, a frequency that Ashford's training had never taught him existed. Ashford's composure was cracking. Sweat had broken out along his hairline, and a muscle in his jaw was twitching in rapid, involuntary spasms. He could hear the distant sound of car engines, the advance vehicles of the funeral motorcade making their way up the cemetery drive. He had maybe 12 minutes. 12 minutes to bring 6 horses back from whatever edge they were teetering on, to rebuild a formation that looked like it had been hit by a mortar round, to present the precision and dignity that a fallen warrior's family deserved. His career in that compressed and airless moment felt like it was balanced on the head of a pin. He turned on Gage Lindquist with a fury born of panic. "I told you to leave. You are interfering with a military funeral, and I will have the MPs escort you out of this cemetery in handcuffs if you do not move right now." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several of the handlers glanced over, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and worry. Threatening to handcuff an elderly civilian at a national cemetery was not by any measure a good look. Gage Lindquist looked at the young captain for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, there was no fear. There was only a deep, weary patience, the kind that comes from having survived enough of the world's emergencies to know that most of them are smaller than they appear. He set his carnation gently on the ground at the base of the oak tree as if placing it on an altar. Then he straightened. It was not a dramatic transformation. There were no swelling orchestral strings, no cinematic camera push. It was a subtle thing, almost imperceptible, like watching the surface of a still pond respond to a stone dropped from a great height. His shoulders, which had been rounded beneath the canvas coat, settled back and down. His spine, already straight for a man his age, found an alignment that added an inch to his height and a decade of authority to his presence. His chin lifted, not with arrogance but with purpose, and his eyes, those pale gray rain-colored eyes, went from soft and observant to something else entirely. They became the eyes of a man who had once held the lives of other creatures, human and animal, in his hands and had carried that weight without breaking. The air around him changed. It thickened. It acquired a gravity that had nothing to do with rank or uniform, or the polished brass of authority. It was the gravity of competence, so deep it had become indistinguishable from nature itself. He took one step forward, out of the shadow of the oak, and into the slanting October sun. He did not hurry. He did not speak. He simply walked, each footfall placed with the deliberateness of a man crossing a frozen river, until he stood at the midpoint of the hitch line, equidistant from the lead pair and the wheel pair, centered in the field of vision of all 6 horses and the cap horse beside them. Sovereign saw him first. The big gelding's head came up, his ears snapping forward, his entire body going rigid with attention. Then Gallant, then Kestrel and Bippip, then the wheel pair, then Dakota, who stopped her frantic circling so abruptly that her handler stumbled and fell to one knee. 7 horses, 3,000 pounds each, every one of them locked onto the old man, like compass needles swinging to magnetic north. The barking chaos of the previous minutes collapsed into a ringing crystalline silence. The handlers froze. Ashford froze. Even the starlings in the oak tree seemed to hold their breath. Gage Lindquist stood among the horses and did something that no one expected. He breathed. Not a normal breath. He drew air in through his nose in a long measured inhalation that lasted 4 full seconds, held it for 2, and then released it through barely parted lips in a slow, steady exhale that seemed to go on forever. It was not a trick. It was not a technique. It was a language, the oldest language in the world between a human and a horse, spoken in the rhythm of respiration, in the rise and fall of its chest, in the ancient mammalian contract that says, I am calm. Therefore you may be calm. I am still. Therefore the world is safe. He did it once. He did it twice. On the 3rd breath, Sovereign's head lowered. Not a little. It dropped until his muzzle was 6 inches from the ground, his neck stretching long, his entire body releasing tension like a dam releasing water. The animal exhaled, a great, shuddering blow that scattered the gravel at his feet, and then he was still. Gallant followed within the same heartbeat. His stamping ceased. His ears rotated from their pinned-back position to a soft, neutral forward, and he dropped his head to match Sovereign's, his body settling into the traces as if he'd been poured there from liquid. The lead pair went next, then the wheel pair, and finally Dakota, the cap horse, the symbolic riderless mount, lowered herself into a stillness so complete that the reversed boots in her stirrups didn't sway by so much as a millimeter. 7 horses. 3 breaths, total silence. The formation was perfect, more than perfect. It was as if the animals had been arranged by a sculptor, each one in precise alignment, each head at the exact same height, each body carrying its weight with a relaxed, balanced grace that the handlers had been trying to achieve for weeks through drills and commands and sugar cubes and all the modern mechanisms of animal management. What they had struggled to accomplish with effort, the old man had achieved with stillness. The handlers stared. Yamada, still sitting on the grass where he'd been thrown, looked up at Gallant with an expression of pure bewilderment. Thorn's hand was still on Sovereign's stud chain, but the chain was slack, unnecessary, as relevant as a screen door on a submarine. The handler who'd wrapped the lead rope around his arm was quietly, carefully unwinding it, his face pale, with the dawning realization of how badly that could have gone. Captain Miles Ashford stood 6 feet from the old rancher with his mouth slightly open and his career assumptions in a state of freefall. He had just watched a civilian, an uninvited, unauthorized, elderly civilian in a canvas coat and cowboy boots, accomplish in 15 seconds what his entire platoon, with all its training, all its equipment, all its institutional knowledge, had failed to do in 10 minutes. The horses hadn't just been calm, they had been commanded, and they had obeyed with a depth of compliance that Ashford had never seen, not in training, not in drills, not in the hundreds of ceremonies he'd overseen. His hand, which had been reaching for his radio to call the MPs, dropped slowly to his side. "How?" he said, and the word came out, cracked, stripped of authority. "How did you do that?" Gage Lindquist looked at him with those gray eyes, and in them Ashford saw something that humbled him more than the display of mastery he'd just witnessed. He saw kindness. The old man wasn't savoring the moment. He wasn't enjoying the captain's discomfort. He was simply waiting for the young man to be ready to hear the answer. "I didn't do anything to them." Gage's voice was low, unhurried, the cadence of a man who had learned decades ago that the most important things in the world cannot be rushed. "I did something with them. There's a difference." From behind the supply truck, Master Sergeant Liddell walked forward. Her steps were measured, her bearing erect, but there was a quality to her movement that Ashford had never seen from his senior NCO, something approaching reverence. She stopped 8 feet from the old man and came to a position that was not quite attention, but carried the unmistakable geometry of respect. "Stillwater," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. Gage Lindquist turned to look at her, and for the first time, something broke through his carefully maintained composure. A flicker of surprise followed by a slow, appreciative nod. "That's a word I haven't heard anyone say out loud in a very long time, Master Sergeant." Liddell's voice was quiet, almost conspiratorial, the tone of someone discussing sacred ground. "I found a reference in a 1963 manual at the Veterinary Corps archives. Water damaged, mostly illegible, but the methodology described, the respiratory synchronization, the postural mirroring, the concept of becoming the herd's center of gravity rather than its controller. It was unlike anything in the modern training doctrine. I thought it was theoretical, something someone proposed but never implemented." "It was implemented," Gage said simply. "Fort Riley, 1961 to 1974, 13 years, 17 horses, 4 riders." He paused, and the weight of those numbers settled over the group like a blanket. "I was the last." Ashford looked between his master sergeant and the old rancher, his confusion a living thing on his face. "Stillwater? I've never heard of it. It's not in any current manual, any training publication, any." "It wouldn't be," Liddell said, still looking at Gage. "The Army disbanded the last mounted units in the early 70s. Everything associated with the horse cavalry was archived, and the experimental programs, the ones that pushed beyond standard doctrine, those were buried deeper. The institutional knowledge just evaporated. The men who knew it retired, went home, became ranchers and farmers and—" She stopped, the sentence completing itself. "And old men who visit cemeteries on Tuesday mornings," Gage finished for her with a ghost of a smile. He turned to Ashford, and his voice took on the quality of someone explaining something important to someone who needed to hear it. Not condescending, not lecturing, just sharing, one man to another, across the gulf of years. "Your horses know their jobs, Captain. They've been trained well. The modern program is good, solid, but it's built on a foundation that it's forgotten. Every horse in this line, every one of them, carries bloodlines that trace back to the original caisson stock from the 1940s and 1950s. The Army bred them carefully, selected for temperament, for steadiness, for what the old manuals called ceremonial bearing. But they also selected for sensitivity, for responsiveness to human presence. Because a horse that carries a hero to his grave needs to feel the weight of that duty. It needs to absorb the grief of the family walking behind it and hold steady. That requires more than training, it requires a connection." He gestured towards Sovereign, who stood motionless, his dark eye reflecting the old man's image. "What happened this morning is that these horses sensed something in me that they're bred to respond to, but have never encountered. The Stillwater method, the way we used to communicate, it wasn't a trick or a technique. It was a relationship. We spent months with each horse, not training them, but joining them, sleeping in their stalls, eating beside them, breathing with them until our respiratory cycles synchronized naturally, until the horse stopped seeing a rider and started seeing a member of the herd, not the leader, not the master, the center." He looked down the line of perfectly still animals, and his expression carried a tenderness that seemed incongruous on such a weathered, hardened face. These horses felt that center today, for the first time in their lives. They felt the frequency of a bond their blood remembers but their experience has never provided. And they didn't know what to do with it. That's why they were agitated. They weren't upset. They were searching. They were trying to find the source of a signal they've been waiting their whole lives to receive. The silence that followed was the kind that settles over a room when someone has said something true. Not clever, not impressive, but true in the way that bedrock is true, undeniable and permanent. Ashford swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. He thought about his 7 new standard operating procedures, his 2 memoranda on stable discipline, his careful, clinical approach to managing animals that he had treated as assets to be maintained rather than partners to be understood. The shame that washed over him was not the hot, defensive shame of being caught in a mistake. It was the cold, clarifying shame of recognizing that he had been operating at the surface of something whose depths he had never imagined. "I owe you an apology, sir." The word "sir" came out naturally, unforced, carrying a weight of genuine respect that Ashford hadn't felt since his first day at West Point, standing before a portrait of Eisenhower and understanding for one brief, humbling moment how much he didn't know. "I threatened to have you removed. I threatened handcuffs, at a cemetery, at a funeral. I was. You were protecting your people and your mission," Gage interrupted gently. "That's not a flaw, Captain. That's an instinct. The mistake wasn't in your impulse, it was in your assumption. You assumed that because I didn't look like I belonged. I didn't. The horses knew better." He nodded toward Yamada, who had gotten to his feet and was now standing beside Gallant, stroking the horse's neck with a tentative, wondering hand. That young man. When Gallant reared, he didn't hit the horse. He didn't jerk the lead. He fell, and the first thing he did when he got up was check the animal before he checked himself. That's not trained. That's born. You've got a natural horseman there. In my day, we would have killed for a kid like that. Yamada looked up, startled by the praise from a man he didn't know, and his face flushed with a pride so raw and genuine that it made Thorne, standing next to him, clap him on the shoulder. Ashford felt something shift inside him, a tectonic realignment of priorities that he understood, even in the moment, would define the officer he became. This old man had solved his crisis, educated him, and then found time to lift up one of his soldiers, all without raising his voice, pulling rank, or claiming credit. It was the most complete demonstration of leadership Ashford had ever witnessed, and it had come from a man in a canvas coat with dirt under his fingernails. "I'd like to know your name, sir," Ashford said. "And your unit, your old unit." Gage Lindquist looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "My name won't be in any roster you can access, Captain. And my unit was deactivated before you were born." He said it without bitterness, without nostalgia. Just fact. The way you might say, the sun rises in the east. Some things serve their purpose and then they end. The mission's the thing that matters, not the men who carried it. He bent down, picked up his white carnation from the base of the oak tree, and straightened with a slight stiffness in his knees that was the only concession his body made to his years. He brushed a leaf from the stem and looked towards Section 12, where the rows of white headstones marched in their perfect internal formula across the green Virginia hillside. "My friend over there," his name was Jessup. Staff Sergeant Corwin Jessup, best rider I ever knew. He could put a horse into a dead gallop on a mountain trail at midnight and never miss a step. We did things together that nobody will ever read about in any report. He died in 2019. I come out here every October, on his birthday, to bring him a flower and tell him about the ranch. He held up the carnation, and in the gesture was an entire world. A world of midnight rides and shared canteens and the unspoken covenant between men who had trusted each other with their lives in places the map didn't show. "He would have gotten a kick out of this morning," Gage added softly, a smile crossing his face for the first time. "He always said I couldn't walk past a horse without causing a commotion." He settled the carnation in his coat pocket, shifted his weight, and looked at Ashford with an expression that was equal parts farewell and encouragement. "Listen to your horses, Captain. They understand more than you think. The manuals can teach you technique, but the animals will teach you truth. And truth, in this line of work, is the only thing that matters." He turned and walked toward Section 12, his boot heels leaving soft impressions in the damp grass, his canvas coat moving gently in the autumn breeze. He didn't look back. The formation held. The horses stood in their perfect, impossible stillness, their eyes tracking the old man as he moved among the headstones, growing smaller with distance until he was just another visitor in a cemetery full of visitors, indistinguishable from any other aging American paying respects on a quiet Tuesday morning. Master Sergeant Liddell came to stand beside her captain. They watched together in silence until the old man reached a headstone in the 12th section, knelt with the careful deliberateness of aging joints, and placed a single white carnation at its base. "You won't find the Stillwater records, sir," Liddell said quietly. "I've looked. When they shut down the mounted programs, they didn't just archive the paperwork, they shredded it. The only proof that it ever existed is standing right there, talking to a headstone. Ashford said nothing for a long time. He watched the old man kneel in the grass, his lips moving in a conversation meant only for the dead, and he felt the full, crushing weight of what he had almost done. He had almost handcuffed a living legend. He had almost dragged the last practitioner of a lost art away from his best friend's grave. The arrogance of it, the blind, rank-drunk certainty that his clipboard and his captain's bars gave him the right to decide who belonged and who didn't, made him physically ill. In the distance, the rumble of the funeral motorcade grew louder. Engines and tires on gravel. The Gold Star family was arriving. In 3 minutes they would round the curve and see the formation, and what they would see would be perfection. 6 horses, motionless and magnificent, a casson gleaming, a cap horse with empty boots reversed, standing as still as a monument. Soldiers in dress blues, their faces set with the solemn, practiced grief of the professional mourner. It would be, by any standard, flawless. But Miles Ashford knew, as he turned from the old man and walked back to his place at the head of the column, that the perfection they were about to witness had nothing to do with him. It belonged to a man in a canvas coat, kneeling alone among the white stones, talking to a friend who had been dead for 7 years. It belonged to a tradition that the Army had forgotten, a bond that transcended training manuals and standard operating procedures, a language spoken between species in the rhythm of breath and the grammar of stillness. He took his position. He adjusted his gloves. He squared his shoulders. And as the motorcade came into view and the bugler raised his horn, and the ancient, terrible beauty of a military funeral began to unfold, Captain Miles Ashford looked at his horses with new eyes. He saw partners, not assets. He saw creatures carrying a genetic memory of something sacred, something that a man in cowboy boots had just reminded them existed. The ceremony was flawless. The family wept. The rifles cracked. Taps echoed across the hills of Arlington like a prayer. And through it all, the horses stood as still as the headstones around them, their bodies calm, their breathing slow, their ancient hearts beating in a rhythm that had been set, just 30 minutes earlier, by the last Stillwater rider on Earth. When the funeral was over and the family had gone and the casson had been driven back to the stable, Ashford walked to Section 12. The old man was gone. The white carnation lay at the base of a headstone that read SSG Corwin A. Jessup, United States Army, with dates that spanned a life of service and a death in the quiet anonymity of old age. Beside the carnation, pressed into the soft earth, was a single boot print, pointed west, toward the parking lot, toward a truck that was probably older than most of his soldiers, toward a ranch somewhere in a state where the sky was big enough to hold a man's secrets. Ashford stood there for a long time, looking at that boot print, feeling the weight of the morning settle into his bones. He thought about his 7 new SOPs and his 2 memoranda, and they felt thin and brittle like paper held over a flame. He walked back to the stable, found Yamada brushing Gallant's coat, and sat down on an overturned bucket. "Tell me," he said, "everything you noticed about how that horse responded this morning, every detail. Start from the beginning." Yamada looked at him, surprised. In 4 months, Captain Ashford had never once asked a specialist for his observations. He had issued instructions. He had not asked questions. Something in the captain's face, a new openness, a crack in the polished armor of certainty, told Yamada that the question was genuine. He pulled up another bucket, sat down, and began to talk. Ashford listened. The horse, standing between them, lowered his head and breathed.